Hi there, and welcome to our latest episode of our course vidcast, Moving Pictures Move You. Today I want to talk quite a bit more about genre because we kind of passed over it pretty quickly in half of one chapter, and yet it's one of the most important features defining how we respond to a film. Indeed, there's really three most important ways in which film can be understood, and the first of those is historically. So, as we've talked in a previous mailbag, prior to 1968, every film was rated general audiences. So violence or the explicit romantic or sexual content was sharply limited. So that effectively determines what can or cannot be in a movie. And history and culture matter in all sorts of other ways. So the political content of a film takes on meaning at different times. For example, Westerns made in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s adhered to a certain idea of America and the frontier, while Westerns made during the Vietnam War took on a sharply political content and addressed violence in very different ways. So history and culture shape what is in a film and how we respond to it. The next is, of course, the technical features of a film, though that's rooted in historical development, largely. So, for example, to complain about a film from the 1920s being in black and white and silent is kind of silly because those technical innovations weren't available then, at least not without extraordinary effort. But the third is genre. Genre largely defines how we respond to a film, and genres appeal to specific audiences, sometimes in seemingly arbitrary ways. For example, in my intro to film classes, I regularly ask, how many of you really like science fiction film? And a lot of hands go up, and most of them are guys. How many of you like romantic comedies? And some hands go up, and almost all of them are women. So these are matters that are situated culturally and historically based on the sort of expectations of gender. Of course, gender is not the only matter that shapes genre. Genre is also a tricky matter because when we talk about a film is a certain type of genre, well, to say the Western, for example, is the film from, I think, 1908. Peter Castor with a quick correction here. Edwin Porter's The Great Train Robbery was released in 1903. The Great Train Robbery, I believe by Porter, it features guys on horses attacking a train, tying up an employee in an office, and stealing from the train, and then a posse on horseback rides to catch them. Is that a Western? Well, not really. I mean, in the period in which the film is set, those were sort of common modes of transportation. So over time, though, we get a sense of what the Western is. So let's talk about a variety of genres. We've got the Western, science fiction, horror, crime, romance, and romantic comedy, the buddy film, the musical. And I want to identify how some of these genres break up and cluster according to certain types. So there's genres that are recognized by their intent, right? So a comedy is a comedy because it's trying to make you laugh. A horror film, curiously, is trying to make you look away. It's trying to be so frightening and horrific that you will literally not watch the film. And then there are the genre of melodrama. So melodrama literally just means music in movie. Melodrama, though, has come to be understood as movies that focus on more the private sphere and the family. Movies with smaller consequences than saving the world, right? So melodramas are often about specific families, romantic relationships, and they're sentimental. They're designed effectively to make you cry. So these genres of intent are also understood as body genres. The film is trying to make the body of the audience do something. Laugh, look away, cry, feel. Right. Then there's genres of setting. So the Western and the science fiction film. The Western, typically set in the West, and it's going to be in sort of desert settings. Monument Valley, most often, is where many of these films were shot in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And of course, science fiction is often set in a futuristic Earth or in space. Then there's genres of character relationships, such as the romantic comedy and the buddy film. The buddy film, if you're not familiar with it, is a film that features typically two characters, most often male characters, but female characters in the case of, say, Thelma and Louise. And one of the earliest sort of buddy cop films was 48 Hours, featuring Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy as an unlikely duo. Of course, the buddy film predates that extensively, and often it features sort of unlikely pairs, sometimes based on racial difference, class difference. Of course, the buddy comedy or the buddy film has expanded with sort of entourage films, and so The Hangover would be an example of this. Then there's genres of narrative and spectacle. So narrative is, as we've talked about earlier in our class and in our chapters, how a story is told, time, space, and causality, difference and repetition. This requires a timeline that moves, so characters begin in one place and then move to another, and events happen along the way. Now, spectacle is, in a sense, the opposite of narrative. Spectacle sort of freezes the development of the plot and instead explodes on screen, often in exciting scenes visually and in terms of sound. So the musical is most clearly a film genre defined by the relationship of narrative and spectacle. So the story develops as characters go through their various actions, and there's a sort of rise in action that reaches some intermediate climax and then drops a bit and then rises to a new climax and drops a bit and then ends with the explosive conclusion. There'll be each of those sort of moments in which the narrative is interrupted is a musical sequence of song and dance. So let's look at some examples of these. Oh man, you done us wrong. Guy right in the eye. We're in the money. Come on, honey. Woo! I got a feeling you're fooling. I got a feeling you're having fun. I get to go by when you are done. Now, another genre that is in effect defined by the balance of narrative and spectacle is the action film. So action films develop as characters go through what constitutes the plot, their set of challenges, most often conflicts with other characters, and yet this narrative is regularly interrupted by spectacular action scenes that often increase in intensity. So for example, in the film The Matrix, the film begins with an action scene, Trinity in Trouble, where she fights a variety of cops in a small space of a room. And the violence is largely, well, her kicking their asses. A later action scene is more spectacular in Morpheus fighting Neo. I know Kung Fu. Show me. Right. And the characters in the audience in the film teach us how to respond. Mouse says, Morpheus is fighting Neo, and everybody races to watch. Now the next action scene grows in intensity as they've cut the hard line, and the agents have attempted to trap Neo and Morpheus and the rest. And then that builds to the next action scene. We're going to need guns, lots of guns, as Neo and Trinity attack the complex. So there's another genre that's a balance of narrative and spectacle that's also a genre of intent and a body genre. That's the pornographic film. And I'm mentioning this because basically no one does. That pornographic films are sort of subterranean. We're in effect not supposed to talk about them. And yet we should know that there are more pornographic films made, largely in the San Fernando Valley in California each year, than all of Hollywood studios combined. So, worth noting. Now, I want to talk a bit more about genre in two very different ways that's very important, and I believe this applies to most film genres. We can talk about film genres in terms of their iconic components. So, we know a film is a Western because it's largely guys wear a certain kind of hat and carry a certain kind of gun, a revolver, and also ride horses. It's set in the American West, outdoors, in sparsely populated areas in the Monument Valley. So we can see these things on screen: a tumbleweed, a cowboy hat, a revolver, a horse, and we know it's a Western. The iconic components of science fiction, you're going to get, well, robots, spaceships, and laser guns. You see those things on screen, you know that it's a science fiction film. A crime film, you can look on the screen and there's going to be a criminal who commits a crime against a victim, and then a third party, or sometimes the victim, him or herself, becomes the avenger to gain vengeance on the crime that's been committed by defeating the criminal. So these are iconic components definitive of genre. In the romantic comedy, of course, it's two characters have what we expect to be a romantic relationship that's interrupted by some conflict, most often a third character. And so we can see this play out in films like Bridget Jones's Diary, My Best Friend's Wedding, and films like this. These are the iconographic components of a genre that define it. And yet, there's a different way of understanding genre that is also really, really important, though it's complex and maybe difficult to grasp, and that's the syntactic sense of genre. Now, syntax is best known as a component of grammar, indeed definitive of grammar. Syntax is not about the content, the semantic value of words, but about the relationship between words. So, I see you reading the book. You hear me delivering course content. The syntactic structures of those sentences are virtually identical, though virtually all of the words have changed, perhaps all of them. Noam Chomsky writes about this in Syntactic Structures and identifies something that's really important, that our brains seem wired for grammar, the human brain. So, for example, colorless green ideas sleep furiously has no semantic value as a sentence, and yet it's grammatically correct. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. To the extent that, having said that sentence twice, you can probably say it back to me directly. However, if I gave you a list of 5 random words, ottoman, generously, Rorschach, panel, fitting, it would be much more difficult for us because we'd be memorizing individual semantic components that don't have a relationship to one another. So syntax is about the relationship between elements. So the syntactic structure of the Western, many critics have pointed out, though I believe Will Wright does it first in Six Guns in Society, a book from the late 60s, that the Western is understood as a set of binary relationships, a set of zeros and ones, a set of this and its opposite. So the West and the East. The eastern seaboard of the United States, often in the mid to late 19th century, and the expanding frontier of the West. It can also be understood as the garden, the cultivated land, and the wilderness, the wild land. It can be understood in terms of civilization and the wild, the undiscovered. It can also be understood in terms of the feminine and the masculine. Also in terms of the white people and the Indians. What makes the Western interesting is these binaries, these 2 separate columns, the East, civilization, the garden, femininity, whiteness, the West, the wilderness, the wild, the Indian. The Western is not defined strictly by these columns and these binaries being separate, but by a central figure or figures who move back and forth between them. Indeed, the iconic, heroic cowboy is not situated firmly in the East, or he wouldn't be a cowboy. He ventures into the West. He traffics back and forth. And that dates back to early American author James or John Fenimore Cooper and his Leatherstocking Tales, including The Last of the Mohegans, which we wouldn't necessarily understand as a Western if we've seen the Daniel Day-Lewis film, I believe directed by Michael Mann. But Fenimore Cooper's work does lay the basis for this notion of the cowboy, so who traffics again back and forth between these binaries.
Why am I talking so much about the Western? I don't even really like Westerns. Well, as we see from Edwin Porter's 1903, The Great Train Robbery, the Western is one of the oldest film genres, and as such has seen some of the greatest amount of scholarship on its structure and its characters and its meaning. The Western kind of faded out in the 1950s for a variety of reasons, though its emphasis on the frontier made it largely replaced by the science fiction film with Exploring Space, The Last Frontier. It saw a resurgence in some sort of deconstructive Westerns, beginning with Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven.
So in The Searchers, John Ford's early 1950s Western featuring Western icon John Wayne. John Wayne's character and a younger man go in search of Debbie, who's been kidnapped by Native Americans. the Comanche or Cherokee. And I believe it's the nephew wants to, or the younger man wants to save her because he's in love with her. And the John Wayne character wants to perhaps kill her because she's been held by the Native Americans so long that she's been perhaps converted. And this is the tension that plays out. What's interesting is the John Wayne character is deeply familiar with the Native American culture that he despises so much, to the extent that he speaks Native American language. So again, the Western figure, the cowboy, who traffics back and forth between those binary spaces. Then we can look at the syntactic characteristics of the science fiction film, which is often defined by the self and the other, the human and the non-human, the known and the unknown. And yet, it's not these static columns, these binaries, but again, the dissolution of the difference between them. So we can see this in our film Blade Runner. Humans and replicants. And yet, the character of Deckard makes this most clear. I'm a person, you are a non-person, a replicant, and yet I am falling in love with you. That the Roy Batty character is more human in effect. He forgives, right? And of course, the central element of the unicorn is the signifier that recognizes the radical destabilization of human, non-human, self, and other. We can also see this in Cargo, right? That, while not immediately visible as a science fiction film, it could be a horror film or a melodrama, in effect. Nevertheless, the presumption of a zombie apocalypse is a science fiction principle, speculative, what if, right? And so there's the human and the non-human zombie. And once the wife at the beginning shifts from human to non-human, the husband has to kill that which is no longer self but other in order to save that which is of the self, the child, which is no longer of the self of the wife because she's now other. Right? She's lost the human status and must be destroyed in order to save the human. And yet at the end, when the main male character is struck down by the remaining humans in their compound, and then they're about to just walk away from his body, but then they discover Rosie, the infant. They determine that they need to bury him. So his non-human status, he was other, and yet the fact that he saved his daughter reintroduces him in some capacity to the self, the human, the known status. So his unknown otherness as a zombie is sort of brought back into the fold of the human because of the sacrifice he committed. We can see this in films like Alien, right? So when a human, played by John Hurt, is sort of penetrated by, not sort of penetrated, is penetrated by the alien. I mean, it's useful to think of this film, Alien. If you haven't seen it, go look it up, and I'm not going to worry about spoilers. It's from 1979. What's interesting about the film is effectively a male character is raped, becomes impregnated, and dies in childbirth. If you have doubts about the legitimacy of that interpretation, I strongly encourage you to go see Prometheus, where that becomes elaborately clear that the self-other human alien invasion is defined in terms of its gendered sexual context. So in Alien, the distinction between the self and the other, the human and the alien, seems clearly established until the seemingly human status of one of the characters comes into question, as he is not alien but other in the form of robot. And we learn, in effect, in that film that it's not necessarily the alien that is the other, that is in opposition to the human, but it's the company itself that was willing to sacrifice all of the humans in order to capture the alien. So the human company is, in fact, becomes the other, the alien, the danger, the horror. And I mention horror because science fiction and horror are deeply bound in terms of their syntactic relationship of self and other, known and unknown. What's most common in the science fiction film is the self and other, known and unknown, become engaged, entwined, accepted to some capacity. And in the horror film, the known and unknown, in engaging, well, the self, the known, must destroy the other, the unknown, in order to save the self. So I think that's a useful way to think about genres in both iconic and syntactic terms. Now, I want to give one more example of the crime film. Now, the crime film is a supra-genre, an umbrella term for a variety of genres such as the gangster film, such as the police procedural, a la CSI, um, the lone wolf detective film, or the lone wolf action film, um, the crime film comedy. Now, I'm drawing here from Tom Leach's book, Crime Films, where he defines this notion of the crime film as a supra-category. And as I mentioned before, the sort of three iconic components of the crime film are the criminal, the victim, and the avenger. But what's interesting about the crime film in these iconic components is, the most interesting aspect is the syntactic relationship among those three iconic components. And what makes the crime film interesting is the degree to which characters do not remain fixed in those positions of being criminal, victim, and avenger, but instead slide between them. So in a film like The Godfather, for example, Don Corleone, played by Marlon Brando, is clearly a criminal, the head of a criminal empire. But in the attempted murder of him by a rival gang, he becomes a victim, right? And Michael Corleone, effectively victimized by the near murder of his father, becomes the avenger, seeking vengeance on the rival families. And yet, in seeking vengeance, becoming the avenger, he thereby becomes a criminal, and indeed becomes the head of that criminal empire. For a near perfect encapsulation of this sense of the crime film as its iconic components, but the syntax of characters shifting from position to position, please turn to Martin Scorsese's The Departed, where, with the exception of the Martin Sheen character, virtually every single character in the film occupies at one point or another all three positions. All right, that's enough for now in terms of genre. We'll have another episode post soon. I hope you folks have a great week this week, and I'm really excited to work with you. Please keep the emails and the phone calls coming. I really enjoy speaking with you and responding to your questions. Have a great day.